Serafina Voss had always known her worth to her father, and it was exactly nothing. She had grown up in the shadow of the Voss pack, a quiet girl with steady hands and careful eyes, learning early that the safest thing an Omega could do was make herself small. She cooked, she cleaned, she stayed out of the way. She asked for nothing and received less. Her mother had passed when she was only 6 years old, and after that, she had lived in the Voss pack hall like a ghost, present but never truly seen. Her father, Alpha Roden Voss, was a man made entirely of bad decisions and borrowed time. He owed gold to half the southern packs and favors to the other half. He drank too much and laughed too loudly and made promises he had no intention of keeping. Serafina had watched him her whole life, and she had learned one thing above everything else. When Roden Voss smiled at you, something was about to go wrong. On the morning of her 18th birthday, he smiled at her. She should have run. Instead, she sat at the long wooden table in the hall and ate the breakfast that had been placed before her: warm bread, salted butter, a cup of tea, while her father stood across from her with that smile stretched wide across his face and his hands clasped behind his back. He told her she looked beautiful. He told her she was growing up. He told her that tonight there would be a gathering in the hall and that she should wear the white dress, the one with the silver buttons, and make sure her hair was done properly. He did not tell her what the gathering was for. She found out when the men arrived. There were 7 of them, all alphas, all from different southern packs. They filed into the hall with the quiet confidence of men who had been invited somewhere for a specific purpose. They did not look around at the walls or the furniture. They looked at her, and the way they looked, measuring, assessing, calculating, made something cold settle in the pit of her stomach. Her father stood at the head of the room and spoke about her like she was not standing right there. He talked about her Omega designation, her age, her health, her temperament. He talked about her scent, how rare it was, how calming, how sought after. He talked about her as though she were something to be appraised rather than a person to be known. Serafina stood very still. She kept her face composed. Inside, she was falling. The man who made the final offer was named Lord Caius Dren. He was older, perhaps 50, with pale eyes and a slow, deliberate way of moving that reminded her of a lizard warming itself on a rock. He did not speak much. He simply looked at her for a long moment, nodded once to her father, and named a figure that made the other men in the room go quiet. Roden Voss shook his hand before the echo of the number had even faded. Serafina did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she could not afford. She stood straight, lifted her chin, and made herself a promise in the silence of her own chest. She would not be destroyed by this. Whatever came next, she would survive it. Life in Caius Dren's estate was not what most people would have imagined when they heard the word captivity. There were no locked doors, no visible chains, no raised voices. The rooms were large and well furnished. The food was good. The grounds were kept beautifully. On the surface, everything looked perfectly fine. But Serafina understood almost immediately that the cage she was living in was built from something far harder to break than iron. It was built from isolation and control, and the slow, steady erosion of a person's belief in themselves. Caius never raised a hand to her. He was far too careful for that. Instead, he reminded her, in small ways, every day, that she belonged to him. She stood beside him at dinners and said nothing. She was paraded before his allies as a display of his status. When she tried to speak, he would place a hand on her arm and smile and say, "She's still adjusting," as though she were a piece of furniture that hadn't quite found its place yet. She read every book in his library. She memorized pack laws from old volumes that smelled of dust and forgotten arguments. She studied power, who held it, how it moved, and where it could be taken apart. Knowledge was the only thing Caius hadn't thought to take from her, and she gathered it quietly, carefully, like someone collecting dry wood before a storm. She had been there for almost 8 months when King Aiden Crest walked into a pack gathering in the southern territories and changed everything. Serafina had not known he would be there. No one had. He arrived without announcement, without fanfare, without the kind of ceremony that usually surrounded a king's appearance. He simply walked through the doors of the gathering hall, with 2 members of his personal guard, and stood at the edge of the room, like a storm that had decided to come inside and rest for a moment. The whole room felt him before they saw him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with black hair threaded through with silver at the temples, despite the fact that he was only in his mid-30s. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and deep and still. He wore no crown. He didn't need one. His authority was something that lived in the way he stood, in the way he breathed, in the way every alpha in the room unconsciously straightened when he entered. Serafina was standing near the far wall, quiet and invisible as usual, when his gaze moved across the room and found her. It was like being struck by something she had no name for, a pull, a recognition, something deep and instinctive, and completely outside the reach of logic. Her breath caught, her hand pressed flat against the wall behind her, as though she needed something to hold on to. He felt it too. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes stayed on her for just a second longer than they should have. And then Caius appeared at her side, placed his hand on her shoulder, and smiled across the room at the king. "Your Majesty," Caius said pleasantly, "I don't believe you were expected this evening." "I rarely am," Aiden replied. His voice was quiet and even, and carried the kind of weight that made silence feel like the natural response. He looked at Caius for a moment, then back at Serafina, and something passed across his face, something that was gone before she could fully read it. Then he turned and walked away. That night, Serafina lay awake in the dark and pressed her hand to her chest, where something ached with a warmth she did not understand and was not yet ready to trust. Things began to change after that night, though at first, the changes were invisible to everyone but Caius. He became tense in the weeks that followed. Letters arrived and were burned immediately. Meetings were held behind closed doors with hushed, urgent voices. His allies came and went from the estate with worried faces and quick footsteps. Serafina gathered every fragment of information she could from the edges of these conversations, piecing together what was happening with the careful patience of someone who had learned to work with very little. Someone was pulling at the legal threads that held Caius's world together. She didn't know who, she suspected, and the suspicion sat in her chest like a quiet, fragile, terrifying thing, because hope, in her experience, had always been the most dangerous feeling of all. Hope could be taken. Hope could be used against you. She had stopped trusting it a long time ago, but she couldn't stop feeling it. King Aiden Crest stood before the High Pack Council 3 weeks after that gathering, and presented a legal argument that had clearly taken considerable time and careful thought. He spoke about an ancient loophole in pack law, one that allowed a blood guardian to sell an unmated Omega as though she were property. He traced the history of the law, outlined its original intent, and systematically dismantled every argument for its continued existence. He did not mention Serafina by name. He did not speak of the bond or of Caius Dren directly. He stood before the council as a king making a legal case, and he made it with the kind of thorough, quiet force that left very little room for disagreement. The council voted in his favor. The law was overturned. Every Omega held under a forced ownership agreement was legally freed. Caius Dren did not accept this quietly. He went before a public gathering of Southern Pack leaders and declared loudly that the king had abandoned reason for personal motivation, that a ruler who dismantled law for a woman was a ruler who could not be trusted. He said it with the confidence of a man who believed that exposing Aiden's reason for acting would somehow diminish what Aiden had done. He was wrong. Because Aiden Crest walked to the center of that same gathering, removed the crown from his head, and placed it on the council table. The room went absolutely silent. "If wearing this crown means leaving an innocent person in chains," he said, his voice steady and clear, "then I don't want it." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Caius Dren stood across the room with his mouth slightly open, and all of his prepared arguments dissolving into nothing, because he had been ready for a political fight. And what he was looking at was something else entirely. Something he did not know how to counter, because it wasn't a strategy. It was simply the truth. Serafina watched the moment on a small screen in the corner of the estate's sitting room, where a staff member had quietly pulled up the news before being waved away by Caius. She sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes did not leave the screen. She watched a king take off his crown for her, and something inside her, something that had been locked down and barricaded and buried under 8 months of survival, cracked open like ground after a long winter. Aiden came for her himself. No army. No announcement. No elaborate display of force or power. He arrived at the Dren estate on a gray morning, with only 2 members of his personal guard, and he walked through the front gates with the calm, unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided how this day was going to end, and saw no reason to rush toward it. Caius Dren met him in the entrance hall. He had aged visibly in recent days. The tension of losing had worn him down in ways that his careful, controlled exterior could not fully hide. He said nothing as Aiden entered. He simply stepped to the side, and Serafina walked out. She had been ready. She had been ready since the morning, since before the morning, since the night she had watched the crown come off and understood, fully, completely, without any room left for doubt, that someone had chosen her, not as a possession, not as a prize, simply as a person who deserved to be chosen. She walked through the hall, past the rooms where she had spent 8 months being invisible, through the front doors, and out into the cool gray morning air. She stopped in front of Aiden and looked up at him. He was watching her with those quiet, storm-gray eyes, and there was nothing in his face but steadiness, and something that looked, if she had to name it, like relief. "You didn't have to do all of that," she said softly. Her voice was even. She had practiced keeping it even. "Yes," he said, without any hesitation at all. "I did." The bond between them, that pull, that ache, that thing neither of them had named out loud, settled quietly in the space between his words and hers. Not like a rush of water or a clap of thunder, more like something finally becoming still. He didn't reach for her. He waited. He simply stood there and waited. And that, more than the crown, more than the council, more than any of it, was what finally, completely undid her. She stepped forward. He opened his arms, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Serafina Voss let herself be held, not as something owned, not as something displayed, not as something bought or sold or traded, but as someone who had finally, after everything, come home. The High Pack Council returned the crown to Aiden by unanimous vote, not because he demanded it back, and not because he had campaigned for it. They returned it because a king who placed justice above his own position was, they decided, exactly the kind of king who should be wearing one. Caius Dren lost everything in the months that followed. His assets were reviewed and seized. The Omegas he had held over the years were found, freed, and supported. He moved through his remaining years quietly and without influence, and the world did not notice when he was gone. Alpha Roden Voss came to the Northern Palace once. He had clearly prepared something, an explanation, an apology, some arrangement of words designed to sound like remorse. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and asked to see his daughter. Serafina came to the gate herself. She stood on the other side of it and looked at the man who had raised her and sold her and called her beautiful, right before he handed her to a stranger. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "You should go," she said simply. He went. She did not watch him leave. She turned and walked back into the palace, back toward the life she was still learning how to live, one that was fully, entirely her own. Aiden was in the courtyard when she returned, speaking with 2 members of his council. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and the conversation paused without him asking it to, because the people around him had learned quickly that when Serafina entered a room, she had his full attention. She met his eyes across the courtyard, and the thing between them, steady, sure, permanent, settled in them both like a warm light. She had been sold for gold once. But gold runs out, gold gets spent, gold sits in boxes and collects dust, and means nothing to anyone who is cold, or alone, or standing at a gate in the gray morning, with nothing left. What Aiden had given her could not be spent, or traded, or taken back. He had given her something that her father never had, and Caius Dren never could. The simple, radical, world-changing gift of being treated like she mattered. And she carried it with her every day, not like a debt to be repaid, but like something that had always belonged to her. Because it had. It always had.